All right. Woo, that's way too loud. Okay. Trying to save my voice a little bit because my wife is sick, my daughter's sick, and almost inevitably this is going to lead to me being sick. And almost always this ends with me losing my voice at some point. I don't want to do that, so maybe if I talk less loud. So far, so good. I mean, usually I can feel it happening. Like it's always happened like in the middle of a lecture. I'm like, oh, that doesn't feel good. And then by the end, I can barely talk. So especially these hour and a half ones. Okay, so we're gonna get started in a sec. We're gonna look at, um, we were talking last time about surveys and survey design and a whole bunch of do's and don'ts and all of these sorts of things. Before I do that, I just want to check in with you and see how everyone's doing. I know I'm working on getting your second lab back. I'm gonna go back to my office after class and shut the door, pretend I'm not there, and or if my boss isn't in, I'm actually gonna lock myself in her office where no one knows to look for me. Um, and her office is way nicer than mine. Um, it's like literally like a corner office. I didn't know that was actually a thing. Anyway, I'm going to lock myself in and try to mark as many of them as I can today before the lab. So hopefully I get through as yours in short order. I was going to do it yesterday, and then unfortunately I ended up getting sidelined with a bunch of emergency stuff that came up. Well, urgent stuff. But I do want to check in and just see if how you're feeling about everything. Doing okay. Any questions you might have? Yeah, please.
Is the lab, do we have labs this week and next week?
So this week, yes, you have a lab this week. Next week is sort of like a help session, right? So there's no official like content, and you're not going to have to do a mini lab associated with it. But it's like I might just set it up instead of in that room. I might set it up either in the cron room, which is just one floor up, or in the CCR space, and people can just stop by. And if you have any questions, you can come by and I'll answer questions and I can help you walk through any things that you're having difficulty with. So yeah, like next week is basically like it's a come if you want rather than a come you must. Well, I mean, there's never a you must come, but it's a come if you want. Like if you're looking for a little bit of extra help or some clarification, or you want to run something by me, I'll be available for probably I'll say like probably an hour on Tuesday and an hour on Wednesday. Just because hanging out for the full 2 hours is usually fruitless because usually people come right at the beginning. Or if you have other times and it doesn't work for you, you can always schedule an appointment with me. I'm only 282 emails behind at this point, so I'm hoping to work through that. I get like 100 emails a day. It's ridiculous. Most of them don't. It's like, we have transferred $10 from this account to this account. I'm like, yes, I'm so glad that's in my email. Thank you for that. And then scholars from other universities who are on the same project as my boss being like, where's my money? I'm like, well, you requested it 6 months ago, which means the U of A has started to work on it now. Because that's how it's going right now. But yeah, I'm a little bit behind, but I'm trying to get caught up. And again, if you don't hear from me in 2 days, 48 hours, forward me another email because I probably lost it. And I wish I didn't, but the volume of email is a little bit. Like honestly, I had my email open from yesterday on my computer, and then it just refreshed, and it was like, I'm like, damn it! I thought nobody emailed me overnight. That would have been super helpful. Okay, so are we all good then? You're good, right? So lab is in. Yeah, I'll have another lab due on Sunday. I will definitely have, your second mini lab in the next couple days. I will have it marked and back to you. So, don't worry about that. Okay. All right. So where were we? What were we doing? Okay, we were talking about survey design, and I know it seems really simple, but obviously I think I've spent enough time complicating it. So we're going to we'll go back a few slides and I'll just kind of quickly recap because I think it's useful, right? The do's and don'ts. Keep your research question in mind, right? So make sure you're answering your right question. Focus on what you want to know, right? Don't ask, irrelevant questions, and be specific, right? Don't ask how many children people have if you want to know, how much it costs them in a month, right? Standard of living. You ask how many children are at home. Don't ask if people are spiritual if you really want to know if they practice a religion, right? Those sorts of things. Try to put yourself in the place of your respondent. Always really good. How would you answer your own question? If you can't figure it out, they won't be able to either. And here are our long list of avoids. Avoid ambiguous terms, right? What does income mean? Avoid long questions, right? Sometimes it can't be avoided, but try to make it as brief as possible. So always edit it down to the very minimum, and avoid double-barreled questions or any question that's asking more than one thing, right? You can get double, you can get triple-barreled questions. Make sure each question is asking about one thing, right? You don't want to know if it was interesting and informative. You want to ask two separate questions. Was the course interesting? Great. Was it informative? Great, right? Then, you're not asking two questions. Okay. Very general questions are to be avoided as well, right? What do you think of the Prime Minister? You would want to ask about a specific thing that the Prime Minister has done. That's what you want to know. Avoid leading questions, right? I made jokes about this last time. But yeah, should the monarchy, which cost taxpayers over $5 million and was implicated in colonialism and is very, very bad, be taxpayer funded or be abolished, right? You wouldn't want to ask a question like that. And avoid, kind of situations where you need to split things into two questions because you're asking, you need a screening question here, right? Do you read Stephen King novels before asking someone to rate Stephen King novels? So that you're not getting a bunch of people answering questions they know nothing about. Yeah, double negatives, no double negatives, that's easy. Jargon and technical terms, avoid them if you can. And be sure your respondents know what they need to know in order to answer. So filtering or screening questions are key. When I talked about symmetry, right? So make sure that your response set is even, right? So that you don't have, too many things that are kind of either bad, right? You have like two good things and then three bad things here, or all things that are kind of good, right? Make sure they're balanced, right? I guess the top one is symmetry. Make sure that your thing actually answers the right question. How satisfied are you in general? Very good doesn't say, very satisfied would be better. And ensure your question answers are balanced, right? So you have not too many things tilting to one side so that 5 out of your 6 answers are positive. You don't want that in a question. Okay, and I guess last, and then we're on to new stuff. Overstretching people's memories, like what can people legitimately remember, right? What can a person reasonably actually be expected to remember? So again, you practicing the questions and being like, how would I answer this question? Or, getting your roommate or someone reasonably normal, not like academics, right, to answer these kinds of questions and just be like, can they answer the question based on what's kind of considered reasonable? Very good. If possible, this isn't always easy. And this is actually a big fight. And I think I said this in the field, between scholars who really want to put don't knows in and people who don't. Try to filter out don't know or refuse to answers as much as possible, just because it's unclear what happens. And sometimes people just use that as a weird kind of escape hatch and it can mess with your data. Okay, so what should you do? Okay, so question order. Generally speaking, right, all respondents should receive questions in the same order, right? Because what you don't, and it says here, unless testing for order effects, right? So if you're testing to see if you ask questions in a different order, would you get a different answer set, right? Would people answer differently, right? So if you started asking, people's opinions about the Me Too movement and you just started asking about, like, say, the Me Too movement, but then, to see if you change the order, right? So let's say you started asking about specific cases that were part of Me Too, right? Like Enzi Zanzaria or whatever, right? You could think of 100 of them, Harvey Weinstein, and you had all of those first. Would it change then how people answered those questions about the Me Too movement? If you're wanting to see whether order, order effects change the way people answer, then you can shift it up so that you have sort of a control group and a an experimental group in a sense, right? You're exposing them to different variables in different ways. You could do that. I honestly cannot remember the last time I heard of someone doing that, but I suppose it does happen. So yeah, I mean, just try to give everybody the same survey. That way people are answering it in the same way. You know, the other thing is, especially when you're doing computer or phone surveys, if you start switching the order, like this is just a practical thing, if you start changing the order of questions, it screws up, you know, the routing in your survey, which can be hours and hours of work to fix, right? Like honestly, once you get a routing error in your survey, I know this because I've spent time and I shifted questions around and I screwed it up. And then I had to like basically, I ended up actually scrapping it and re-entering all the questions because I had screwed it up so bad that I couldn't fix it. Anytime you like try to change routing, you're going to end up with a bunch of errors. Like even on a paper survey, you know, it'll be like, okay, all right, if they answer yes, then turn to question 14, and you didn't quite order them properly, and suddenly question 14 has nothing to do with what you were just talking about. This happens all the time. You'll catch it in testing or in the first few surveys, but it could mean just hours of work of you kind of fixing stuff if you start changing question orders. And it gets really, like honestly, even a short survey, even something like 30 questions, once you start getting routing errors working in there, it gets mind-boggling because you like unpacking where it all went wrong it can be hours of work, and no one needs that. Typically your earliest questions, right, should be related to the announced research topic, right? So generally, you know, you want to put so like if you say you're doing a survey on, let me give you a real world example here. When I was doing like my first two surveys on this research project I did for the Catholic agencies in Edmonton, we started basically, you know, we wanted to know stuff about Catholic agencies. And that's, we started, right? We asked about all the Catholic agencies, about what people knew about them, how they felt about them, all these sorts of things. That was at the beginning of the survey. At the end of the survey, we asked some other questions that were a little bit less related. So these were questions like, you know, they wanted to know specifically, because they're Catholic, so they cared about this, you know, the principles of Catholic social teaching. How do people feel about those? So things like environmentalism, care for the poor, there's a whole bunch of them, right? Protection of the family, all these things that are part of Catholic social teaching. And we put those at the end, right? Basically because it wasn't directly related, but they wanted to see like, okay, how would an atheist feel about, you know, Catholic social teaching if you watered them down into kind of these general statements? But we didn't want to put that at the beginning because people might have been confused, right? Because they're like, oh, I signed up for this survey about, you know, Catholic hospitals and schools in Edmonton, and I don't know what is going on. Like, why am I being asked these weird questions about whether how I feel about this statement? Like, you know, it is important to protect the environment, right? Interesting, and we got a lot of really cool data out of it, but that wouldn't have been appropriate to start with. Questions likely to be of interest to respondents should be asked early in a survey or an interview, right? So again, like put those things at the beginning. And it's kind of a hook, right? Like you give them what they were expecting and you give them their chance to kind of state their opinion on the things that they were expecting to answer. And then you move into things that are a little bit less related. Once you get kind of middle part of the survey, the end of the survey almost always, for the most part, is demographics, right? The last 10 questions are usually like, you know, age. Well, I mean, you might ask that at the beginning sometimes. But things like race, income, my favorite ones are always like, what political party did you vote for in the last election, right? Like in the last few, and you ask people those, because it's always really interesting to kind of track that on other answers people have. Those are like the end questions. So yeah, like your most related questions to the topic right at the beginning. In the middle, you could ask some that are more tangential to what you're kind of interested in or what you said you were interested in. And then the end is usually like hard on demographics, right? What's your income, household income, how many children do you have? All of this kind of stuff. Sensitive questions should be asked right, like usually kind of well into it. Towards the end, right? Towards like when you might be getting to, say, your demographic questions, but not right at the end. And the logic here is if you ask these too much up front, you are going to get people exiting, right? Because they're, you might trigger people. So if you kind of have these questions right at the beginning, you're going to have people that are just like, whatever this survey is about, it's too much for me. I'm going to exit. If you have it kind of towards the end, right, they've already sunk a bunch of time in, and people, even answering voluntary surveys will kind of be in that like sunk cost fallacy, right? Well, I've already put 15 minutes into this survey and I don't get my points on the app that I'm using to do surveys if I don't finish it. So I'll just go ahead and, I didn't like that question, but I will continue on and finish the survey, right? So not right at the end shouldn't be your very last questions, because then you're going to leave a bad taste in people's mouths. So it should be like towards the end of the middle, I guess, and then into your, demographics and all that kind of closing stuff that you would tend to ask. You bring that after really sensitive questions. Now, you may not have sensitive questions, right? You might very well have a survey that's completely free of them. If you do have them, right? Just imagine if you were to open up a survey and the first thing you see is, have you ever been the victim of sexual assault? And be like, whoa, right? Like that's like, a bit of a survey question punch in the face, right? So you don't want to start with that, but don't leave it till right at the end either, because then people may be really upset with you as like, oh, by the way, as a last question, have you ever been not a good look either. And there's a lot of, I think you could probably sort of understand when you're doing survey research, there's a lot of impression management that you're doing with the potential person that you think might be doing your survey, right? You're trying to anticipate what their feelings might be if you ask questions in a particular way. Because your goal as a researcher is A, don't traumatize them, and B, you need them to finish, right? Because you can't use incomplete answer sets, right? If someone quits at question 29 out of your 30 question survey, you gotta typically throw that data in the garbage. So you just lost out on a potential data set. And it's hard to get respondents. It costs a lot of money. Either because you're paying someone to do phone interviews, not anymore, nobody does this anymore because it's not effective. Call Display made phone interviews and phone surveys very ineffective. Except for me, because I do survey research. So when survey companies call, I feel like this moral obligation to answer them. I'm like, fine, I'll answer your stupid survey. But everybody else is like, oh, Leger research, not answering that. Or, my phone now is everything's just likely spam. Thanks. Google sorts everything. If I could get them to sort my mother-in-law into likely spam, I'd be happier. There you go. But okay, right. A lot of impression management, a lot of like psychology, not deep psychology, but just impression psychology is going into getting people to finish your darn survey, because you need that data, right? If you're doing survey research. Okay. This is a hard one, but it's super important. Avoid provoking a response set, right? So a response set, exists if responses are motivated by something other than a person's actual feeling about the item. And this can be a lot of things, right? Now, amongst the problems you can end up with in a response set is, I'm bored of this survey, but I want the points because, I'm almost close to that $25 gift card. So I'm just going to answer, the same thing all the way down in order to, get my points. Other things are, I think I know what all of these questions are asking. And so I'm going to answer them all in a specific way to get through it very, very quickly, right? Because people don't, I guess at the end of the day, most people don't really want to be doing your survey, right? Like, it's a sort of, some people, like psychos like me, will sign up for, apps to do surveys to earn points. But there's also problems with this. Like when we have online panels, we know we're getting the same people over and over again answering surveys. So there are some problems there. Most people don't want to answer your survey, right? They're doing it out of a courtesy or for some other reason. And so response sets can happen very, very easily. Response sets, though, are data that typically you're going to isolate and throw away, right? Because for whatever reason, like if someone answered just like strongly agrees to everything or very important to everything, there's a really good chance they just didn't read the questions and they just selected those answers all the way down. And so you kind of have to throw that out. Otherwise, it's going to mess up your data, right? Because you have these sets. So there's always, right, like SPSS and R. It's really easy to go and find like, hey, what are likely response sets, and toss them in the trash, right? Like ignore these ones in what you're doing, or you just delete them out of the data completely. Sometimes people get angry, people get bored, people get frustrated, and they just want to get through the survey as quickly as possible. And so you kind of have to, again, there's a little bit of like amateur psychology that goes into building questions so you don't get response sets. And if your survey is too predictable, right? If your survey is too predictable, people will start to kind of just answer things without even really reading the question. Okay, so ways to avoid this. Using multiple item measures, things that call for logically opposite positions can be a way, right? So I don't know, that sounds really blah, 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 but you can ask about the same thing twice, right? As a way of kind of eliminating people who are just doing a response set, but you ask it in opposite ways, right? Like you could ask, let's say you go with a Likert scale. The University of Alberta has enough parking on campus to accommodate those who need to park. Okay, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And, then you have the opposite. The University of Alberta's parking situation is a complete disaster. So complete opposite, and you give the same kind of sets. It's not a great example, right? But let's say you ask the same thing in kind of or backwards ways, right? I'm blanking on thinking about an example. I'll come up with it in a few minutes and come back to the slide maybe. But basically, right, if you have you make the same essential statement, but you word it in opposite ways, right? You can have these sorts of, you can see, so like an agree and disagree statement, like the same thing, like I agree, the University of Alberta has great parking, what would be the like saying the same thing, but in a kind of negative way. There isn't anything stopping people from parking on campus that want to, right? Like almost like a double negative to make people think. And then you can see if people are kind of coming up with a response set, right? If they're just answering strongly agree to everything, right? So you just kind of have to think about it, right? You want maybe to ask things in weirdly opposite ways. Ask the same question twice. The other one, this is the one I really like, is just a random question, but it makes sure that people are paying attention, is you give them something completely irrelevant. Right? And this you'll see if you use LegerWeb or any other online survey platform, it'll be like, you're doing a survey about parking at the University of Alberta and you get a question like this. Select the fruit. And then you have like carrot, pig, apple, spam. I can write. Yes, I can. Right? So in this case, right, you're going to know that if someone gets this question, so if someone's just picking the top, the top set of everything, right, they're going to pick carrot. And you're going to know that they're not paying attention to your questions. They're just blasting through and picking either random options. Because it's not a hard question, right? Everybody's going to know from this list that the only one you could pick is apple. I'm going to leave this so that future classes are concerned and wondering what the hell we teach at university. It's like, are there students that can't pick out from that list, right? I see this one a lot, right? And it's another way of kind of isolating out response sets, or sometimes just waking up your respondent, right? Just ask them a random question that's completely irrelevant in the middle, and it might confuse them, but it can be other things. Like you can make it funny. It's like, which of these would you wear on a cold day, right? And you like have like shorts, a a coat, flip-flops, or a tank top, and just have them pick. And it just weeds out response sets because people have to like focus in on that question. Or if someone's like bang, 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 you know immediately that they're just answering it without thinking, right? And so it makes it really, really easy at the end of the day. And those are the ones I like. Sometimes the opposite worded ones can work well too, because then you're like, oh, they answered the same thing twice, but in different ways. So they're obviously not paying attention to the question. This kind is like, okay, they weren't even reading the questions. They're just checking random things or checking the first thing or whatever it happens to be. Sorry, does that all make sense? All right, I know. Okay, ooh, vignettes. Vignettes are fun. I use these on exams too, so you'll be well familiar with them. If you've taken like SOS 100, you'll have a good sense of what these are, right? So vignette questions, right? These are basically questions that kind of tell a story, right? Present a scenario and ask, how the person would respond, right? So, I mean, it's meant in a sense sometimes to, present just something that people can think about. A real life, sometimes you'll get into this thing where you're asking questions and it seems really, really abstract. But say you want to know something even just about some personality. I mean, this is going to sound like a BuzzFeed quiz. Oh my God. Some about the personality characteristics of somebody that's taking your survey, right? Or for the people taking your surveys. You might ask them like, so, I don't know, you're interested, you're doing research for like a food company, right? It's Saturday night. Karen is sitting at home on the couch. She's hungry, she is, the weather's bad. She's feeling a little blue. Which of the following food delivery services do you think would be the best for her to order from, right? And it's like, okay, so then I put myself in the place of Karen, and I'm like, well, of the ones in town that I know of, right, Skip the Dishes is the best because it has the best selection or whatever, right? You tell a little story, you give them sets, or it can be, deeper things like, Sandra, considers herself left-leaning. She cares about the poor and social justice. She's in favor of defunding the police. Which of the following political parties do you think best represents Sandra's views, right? And then you get a sense of like, okay, based on these kind of political ideas that I've presented, how does the respondent judge the different political parties in Canada, right? And then you give them the political parties. And again, sometimes it can make for more candid answers, right? So it creates a distance between the question and the respondent, which is good, right? Because sometimes you want to get people thinking just a little bit outside of their own personal experiences. Sometimes it's more candid, right? People are freer. And I'll tell you in a second about one other kind of question. It's not really a vignette question, but it's another way of creating this distance that's actually worked really well in election polling. I'll tell you about it in a sec. So it's hopefully people can be more candid because they're not, even if like, say, you're talking about a touchy subject, right? One that maybe has a lot of kind of social opprobrium attached, and you're worried about, social desirability bias, right? So this, where people think they're going to answer how they feel like they should answer, rather than what they actually think. Sometimes vignettes can get people because they're not talking about, Jeff is not talking about Jeff. Jeff is talking about Karen and what Karen thinks, right? And so I can kind of detach my own personal feeling of like, well, Jeff should answer this way. I really should say that, I exercise every day, right? But I don't, obviously. But because there's social desirability, I might want to answer that way. If I create a vignette about someone and their exercise habits, right, I might answer more candidly than I would about myself. How people say they would act in a particular situation might be different from how they would really act, right? So how they think someone else might act too, that could be. Or if you ask like, hey, if you were, in this situation, what would you do? That might be different. But it can provide useful information as a starting point, right? Or even, right, it takes people out of their own mindset. Okay, one other way that these kinds of distancing questions work, and we noticed this especially in 2016 in the United States, and it's become something that you see a lot more in the industry now. So, like if you go into polling or market research or anything like that, or even academics, one of the things that people have started doing is to create that distance rather than asking what you would do. So you don't ask the person directly. It's like, okay, for instance, how do you think your neighbor will vote in the next election? And the reason this is interesting is because what you're actually getting is probably their sense of how they're going to vote, but it takes out that social desirability bias. And why this is interesting is because in that 2016 election, in the US, there was Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, right? And Donald Trump being Donald Trump, there was a little bit of social desirability bias that obviously worked its way into the polls because, coming up to election night, the New York Times was putting it, I think, at a 95% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win that election. The only polls that had it kind of right were the ones that asked neighbor questions, right? So when people asked, hey, not how are you going to vote in the next election, but how do you think your neighbor is going to vote in the next election? Those ones actually predicted Trump in most of the states that swung Trump's direction pretty reliably. It was about 94% of the time, as opposed to people asking what you would think. Because people were like, even though I know I'm answering like a phone survey or an internet survey, Donald Trump is kind of gross. And I don't want to say that I would vote for him, but maybe my neighbor's going to vote for him because I know we're kind of similar, right? Typically people think of their neighbors as kind of like them. My neighbors have a dog. I don't like their dog. But other than that, they're very similar to me. Why you would buy a dog this big, I've never quite figured out. And that mostly sits outside and goes, bark, bark, like 4 hours at a time. I hate that dog. Anyway, but aside from that, my neighbors and I are quite similar, I think. So if I was to be asked, like, who do I think they're going to vote for? Well, given the completely non-competitive riding that I live in, I could probably make a good guess. But generally, right, you can ask this question. It creates that distance. Like, what do you think your neighbor would do? Right? What kind of brands do you think your neighbor would be interested by? It's actually really useful for just creating that little bit of distance and taking out that social desirability bias. Because suddenly I'm not asking about you, I'm asking about your neighbor. Yeah, please.
Would that be a good time to say, like, I don't know? Or I think you don't know.
I would probably, like, if you put in I don't know, there's a good chance that you're going to have a lot of people answer I don't know. So I would probably leave it out of that question just because, like, just make a guess, right? Just have people make a guess and you'll probably get a better sense. Yeah, in the back.
How many questions should we put in a survey?
Oh, so that is entirely dependent on the overall length of your survey, right? The one thing, and it's a really, really good question, because vignette questions are a little bit longer, right? In terms of, even just reading them, right? Or having someone read them to you, because you have to, like, okay, and think of it like if you've ever done a multiple choice exam and it's like, it tells you like, oh, this person, a little story about a person, then asks you to class them as like a conflict theorist, functionalist, right? All these categories that sociology likes. They are longer to read. And so even like when I'm designing an exam that has vignette questions, I'm like, I can't have more than 10% of the questions be vignette because they're going to take too long for the people to read. Especially like if you might be in a situation where maybe English is a second language, vignette questions for, people who aren't native speakers might be a little bit harder to interpret. So I would say kind of rule of thumb, 10 to 15% of your survey at most. But there's not like hard and fast rules. It really depends on how, like if your survey is 10 questions, you could go beyond one vignette question. You could have 5. If your survey is 86 questions, I would definitely say don't have, like 15 of them be vignette questions because you're going to get a high non-response rate, right? So, but it's a good question. I wasn't sure. She very quickly nods no. All good. How are you? Are we good with this one? Okay, I know I've told you too many things, but yes, Rules for designing questions. Run a pilot study. Okay, so this is useful in a couple of ways, right? So what a pilot study generally is you say like, rather than doing, putting my survey out there in the world at first, I am going to do a subset, right? I'm going to do a smaller population set to basically test the questions, right? So, and generally so there's a couple of useful things here. And this is how I've done it in the past. When you go to ethics and you get your pilot study approved, it's pretty easy, right? So you're doing your pilot study. You can just tell ethics, it's like, hey, I'm doing a pilot study. And then later, rather than going through the whole ethics process again, you just go and you're like, hey, I'm amending my pilot study. It's now my full study. I'm going to not just do 100 people, now I'm going to do 1,000, right? And often that slips through ethics really fast because they're not paying that close of attention to amendments. Tricks of the trade. Don't do immoral things like I do, but totally worth it at the end of the day sometimes. All right. Pilot studies, right? Okay, so you test individual items or the whole kind of survey to see if it works, right? The nice thing about a pilot study is, it might cost you a bit of money, right? And a bit of time to do it. But at the end of the day, you'll find out if there are problems. If you have questions that really don't work, like if the data comes back and it's a garbled mess that you just cannot understand, you'll get this out of a pilot study, right? When you kind of go and run the data, it works really well. Sometimes, open questions in a pilot study, right? Even like something really stupid, like tacking your last question before you get to demographics as being like, is there anything else you think we should know about this topic, right? And you might from there generate a whole bunch of really interesting ideas about things you didn't think about, right? Just end your survey with, is there anything else you think we should know about this study? You probably get a lot of people that just don't answer it. But the people who do answer it might give you some ideas about areas you didn't ask about that could open up real areas of kind of interest. If you're doing it with actual interviewers, right? So people who are, administering the survey, again, it's rarer nowadays because we don't have as many phone interviews. We're mostly doing internet now. But like the one that's happening out of the CCR in a few months, we're actually sending people into prisons to do the survey with incarcerated people. So we are doing sort of a pilot study. We're going to the smallest prison in Alberta to try it with the fewest number of people. The last time they did this, it went really bad the first day, and they spent the entire night of the first day redesigning the survey. So that's how these things go. And so day one was their pilot study. And it was apparently, I was not on the team at the time, but it was apparently not a very fun night. Because it's like, okay, our survey doesn't work. Let's fix it. You learn this by doing it, right? And sometimes you can't know enough about it until you've actually put your tool to the test, right? But it can provide interviewers too with experience, right? Sometimes these things don't flow as well and as easily as you think they might, and people might be really janky. And janky interviewers can kind of irritate people responding. And so, testing it out can be a really good thing. Sometimes people do pilot studies even just with like a group of friends. It's like someone in Matt pretends that they're an incarcerated person, and they try to answer these things like an incarcerated person would. That doesn't work as well because you're not getting a real sense, but it can be workable. Ensure that there's variability in the answers given, right? You can see where response sets might come in, and kind of then put in things to block response sets. You might, identify questions that are embarrassing and uninteresting. This is the big debate with the one we're working on right now in the CCR, because I think the survey is too long. At the moment, my boss is not listening to me, but it's 86 questions is way too long. I guarantee it's going to end up whittled down to like 50 at most, because there's a lot of questions that are, I think, uninteresting, and that people are going to be like, I don't know, I can't remember. So anyway, you can identify things like that in a pilot study, and then whittle them out, which is good because then you don't get a bunch of junk data. You don't get a bunch of stuff getting in the way of your survey when you actually run it. You don't get as many people quitting. It's a all good. Yeah, hard to answer questions or hard to understand questions you can weed out. If you have instructions, usually there's not much for instructions, but even sometimes you have things like select all that apply, and you may want to highlight that in particular ways or put all your select all that applies in a kind of cluster so people know. Because sometimes if you shift from like, a Likert scale where it's like choose one and then to a different section where it's like select all that apply, right? Like what kind of food do you like? Select all that apply. People might only pick one if it comes right after a single answer area. So you want to make sure your instructions are clear and that it's structured in a way that people are going to answer it really correctly. And yeah, flow is a little bit subjective, but just that that your survey, which the textbook calls an instrument, is a measurement instrument, right? Has satisfactory flow, that it goes kind of smoothly, that there aren't really harsh transitions, that you have that structure of important information at the top, more tangential things in the middle, and then your controversial middle, and then your ending is demographics, right? That the whole thing kind of flows in meaningful ways. And that's what pilot studies are. And you should, if you have the capacity to do so, and you don't always, certainly like I said, my pilot studies, I think I ran them on my parents and my sister and a couple of my cousins, because that's all I could manage, because, hey, I had backers with money, but they didn't want to spend it on a pilot study. Even a little bit of data will help make things flow better. Okay, although don't pick people who are too nice to you. I have a uniquely bad relationship with my parents in some ways, and so they're perfectly fine telling me I screwed something up, which my wife says has caused issues, but I'm not going to go there. Always seeking their approval. What does she know? But anyway, they're willing to be harsh. But if your parents are like nice and normal people and they're just going to tell you did a great job, sweetie, they're not the right people to do your pilot study, because they're not going to give you good feedback. Okay. So, rules for designing questions. And I've already told you this, but I'm going to tell you again. Using existing questions can be beneficial. Especially, and there's a lot of you in this class that are interested in very particular phenomena that are already well served by existing tools. Things like loneliness, ADHD, neurodivergence, things like autism spectrum disorder, Tourette's. Like there's all sorts of things that have these, depression, anxiety, right? We have really decades-old diagnostic tools for this that you can use for your survey, right? And this is to avoid you making sort of obvious mistakes. And like in past years, right? Like, someone wanted to know about depression, right? And they asked questions like, when was the last time you showered? Because they had this kind of pop culture idea that people who are depressed don't shower. And maybe that's true. Like, or do you have trouble getting out of bed in the morning? And I'm like, well, I've never been diagnosed with clinical depression, but I hate mornings. So, that's not a very good question for measuring depression. And people if you try to reinvent the wheel and your own maybe like non-specialist idea of, what ADHD looks like, if you're like, what's your attention span? How long can you pay attention to something? You're much better to go with, a diagnostic tool that exists. Hang on. I think I have one. I will. Because I just downloaded it to show someone. And this is not going to show up in the recording. I'm sorry. But something like this, right? So adult ADHD self-report scale, right? See if I can blow that up a little bit. So you can see the kind of answer set, right? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often, right? And you have all of this kind of, how often do you have trouble wrapping up final details on a project, right? Once the challenging parts have been done, right? How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations, right? These are all, really, and all of these are scored, right? I don't know if the scorecard is at the bottom. It's not. But you could find this, and this is the ASR V1.1 symptom checklist for ADHD, right? So you can go and find the scorecard because each of these responses is scored 1 out of 5, right? And after a certain point, you're going to say, yeah, that person probably has ADHD. But it would be hard for you as a non-specialist to come up with these types of questions, right? To really know what kind of question to ask that's going to diagnose something like ADHD really well. But there's absolutely nothing wrong. And I'll say this. There's nothing wrong with using these kinds of tools and even existing questions, right? Like if, say, you found an existing social science study, right, that you thought did a really good job. Say you were, I don't know, like you're asking about, religion in the United States, and you were like, man, that survey did a nice job. I would love to do that in Canada. Like, I think Pew Research's questions, man, what great questions. They published them. I see your question there. The only thing you can use them, but like all academic things, just cite them. Like, be like, hey, I'm using the ASR or ASRS V1.1, which I got here, right, which was created by, this person. And that's all you need to do. I'd have to look up how you actually cite this in like APA. I don't remember, but it's perfectly acceptable to do. Yeah.
Do you have to include like the score chart?
For like if someone was answering, no. Like if you're doing it and you're gonna be like what you would do in like basically R or SPSS, right? Is you would take these answer sets and then you would tell the software, you'd write the code so that it's like for each case, total up that score. So, you'd say, yeah, this is a 1, this is a 2, this is a 3, this is a 4, this is a 5. And then, whatever it is, like say it's out of 100, everybody out of that scores above 60 out of 100, class them into the ADHD category. And then you could be like, okay, so now I can say people who have ADHD, they answered these other questions I asked in the following way, right? But you don't have to tell them how you're scoring it or anything like that, right? And you wouldn't even necessarily have to use the entirety of an existing scale. You could use part of it, right? And that would screw up the because this has a very set out how much you would score the whole thing. But other tools, if you're only interested in certain aspects and there's something an existing tool is asking about that you're not interested in, you could omit part of the survey. And then you just come up with your own scale as to what you're going to class as ADHD or lonely or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it just gives you a starting point, right? And you can alter them a little bit based on what you need, but don't be afraid to use existing tools ever, right? It's not plagiarism if you cite it, it's academia, which is plagiarism, but with citations. Okay, I did have, oh my gosh, one student very, just like selected 10 pages of text and put it, this was a long time ago, in quotation marks and cited it, and that was their essay. And I'm like, I think this still classifies as plagiarism because you didn't do any of the work. Also, you cited my supervisor, which is weird. So you basically stole my supervisor's work, and we don't have a good relationship. So that's not going to fly. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, that's academia is plagiarism with citations. As long as the citations are there, it's not technically plagiarism. Okay. Yeah, original source has to be cited. Yeah, the nice thing too is like it can allow you to compare results from different studies, right? So if you're using the same question sets as, say, the General Social Survey, right? You can compare your results, like say, because the General Social Survey in the US runs every 2 years, which is not bad, but say in Canada, right, the census questions only run every 10 years, right? The big long form census. You could take an aspect of that. Say again, you're wanting to be asking about religion, right? Well, I want to know something about religion in Canada, because I think that gap, 2001, 2011, 2021, those are too long of gaps. So right in the middle, I'm going to do a survey of 3,000 Canadians on religion, right, in 2025, right? So 5 years, or 2026, I guess. So 5 years into the census period so that I can get, a look at what religion looks like. But then I can still take, because I'm asking the same questions, all of that census data and compare my results to it or add my results to it. So perfectly legitimate to do. And again, there's really good reasons for using this kind of approach, right? Again, the questions work. So it can be a real time-saving method, right? If you don't have to, you can skip the pilot study if you know your questions work. And if you're using someone else's questions, and especially if it's a tool that's been in use for a long time, the questions work, right? So it can be a time-saving measure as well. You can modify them a little bit. Obviously, the more modification you make, the less you can compare to the original source, right? Or compare across studies. But there are times, even like, if you were gonna repeat a study, right, that was done in the 1970s, but you were like, some of that language is a little bit outdated and people aren't gonna understand it anymore. You need to put it in the lingo of the times. You can modify it a little bit and still say the questions are comparable, right? So, suit your purpose better, to update language, right? You want to rerun a study that was run in, 1970. And I've seen people do this, right? There was a very famous study. It was on scientists' opinions about the existence of God and how religious they are. And, basically they took this study from 1971, reran it in 1991, reran it in 2021, and there's tweaks to the language because sometimes the language has evolved a little bit, even in that, relatively short span, 20 years, and then a further 20 years. But, regardless, right? Use it as long as it's comparable. You can still look back on those older surveys. Okay, does this all make sense? I know, I'm like, you never thought you'd have 2 full classes on just writing survey questions. There's a lot to think about. This is why I say, like, it sounds really easy, like operationalization. It's like, oh, that sounds super easy. It's actually extremely difficult to do properly. Writing good survey questions, it's a skill. It's not something you can just like regurgitate, like every other sociology class where, do multiple choice exams for the first 3 years or just regurgitate information. It's a skill and it requires practice. And so again, if you're struggling when you do your mini lab, that's due on Sunday, everybody struggles the first time they make a survey. It's perfectly normal because it's a skill, right? It's something that you get better at the more you do. And I know people have been doing it for 10, 15 years that still, they look at their survey and they're like, after they run their pilot study, and they're still, that was crap. Like, that question sucks. Because, it's a really difficult thing to do. Okay. Yeah, questionnaires, surveys, I kind of use these interchangeably, right? Because now almost all survey research that we're doing are not interview-based, they're questionnaire-based because we've shifted so much to online. So I just call them all surveys, right? Phone surveys, online surveys, because it makes more sense. But, in the kind of official lingo of the field, where you have a structured interview without an interviewer, you're technically doing a questionnaire. It used to be that we mailed out forms, right, to people, like you mailed out the census to households, or you sent, all sorts of companies and social agencies and researchers used to just like random mail stuff to people and just hope that they opened the package and answered the survey and mailed it back. We don't really do that anymore because, mail surveys are just not the way to go. It's expensive for one. Mailing stuff is quite expensive, and your response rate is absolutely abysmal now because nobody wants to answer surveys. Increasingly now, we're doing it online. Like I said before, this comes with its own kind of attendant problems. The big one being that most of the big online survey portals are relying on one of two things, which is like online advertising to try and attract people, and it is. I can tell you this because I did try to do this through SurveyMonkey. It is bloody expensive to recruit through online ads. Like, if you want to know how much a Facebook, having delved into this, a Google ad or a Facebook ad where Facebook is guaranteeing a certain response rate. If it's like, what response rate do you want? Like 10%? Not that expensive. When you get up to 80%, it is phenomenally expensive. So like recruiting random people through social media is really expensive and hard. I tried it through Facebook ads. I tried it through SurveyMonkey. I tried it through Google ads, and it was all like ridiculously expensive. The online panels, though, the ones that are run by companies like Abacus and Leger, which again, you don't need to know for the purposes of the assignments you're doing. The problem is that it's people who signed up for those panels. And so if you do multiple studies through those panels, what you're going to find eventually is that you won't know it, but you're getting the same people over and over again. So a representative sample can be really difficult to establish. You're going to get maybe enough people, but the representativeness of that sample is going to be skewed. It's going to skew a little bit middle-aged, right? Because younger people don't tend to do online surveys. Middle-aged people tend to, and elderly people, while they have the time, they might not have ever thought to sign up for online panels. So has a bunch of problems attended to it as well. Because you do have to add simpler questions sometimes because generally people might not be super specialized and you might not know how well they're going to understand your question. Okay, does that all make sense? I know you're all looking very bored. It's like, oh, more on surveys, but we have more slides and more Dilbert cartoons. Compared to interviews, questionnaires tend to have fewer open questions because closed questions are easier to answer, right? And honestly, like even in online, open questions are a bit of a bleep show at the best of times because people will write like 2 words, right? If you were actually interviewing someone and you left like an open space in it, they're likely to talk to you a little bit because you're face to face or you're on the phone. Online, it's going to be like 5-word sentences that are barely coherent. So open questions don't tend to work as well. You have to have a simple design so everything can be done without difficulty. This is something that marketers struggle with. I will say this, I've done enough of these stupid online surveys. Marketers are terrible at this. Get good at this, sign up with a marketing agency, and you will be the golden child because they are bad at it. Honestly, I've quit so many surveys because it was like repetitive questions, questions where I wasn't sure what they were asking, where like I'm on like the 5th page of rating brands and I want to die. I don't want to do your survey. I'd rather throw myself off a bridge. Like simple designs, like if you can master this, I swear, go into marketing, take your psych degree and go into marketing and your psych soc degree, go into marketing and be really good at asking like customer service questions. And I swear you'll be rich. You'll become a consultant. You'll go work for like KPMG, and you'll make a ton of money because you're going to be like the survey king or queen and you're going to do great at it. Because honestly, I will say marketing, they suck at this. I don't know who they have doing this. I think it might be, people who have never answered a survey and don't know what a survey should look like. And it's very aggravating as someone who cares about this, as you can tell. Okay, yeah, typically like online surveys especially have to be short or, those mail surveys that nobody does anymore have to be short because, the longer it is, the more likely people are going to hang up. I think that's the case too with phone or in-person interviews. Increasingly, people are just impatient and busy, and they're not going to give you the time of day if your survey's dumb and long. Which is what I'm trying to convince my boss at. Like, yes, I know you're going to prison and you think they're locked in with you, but I'm pretty sure they can still leave if you irritate them too much with your 86 question survey. Yeah, please. So survey, I use these. So the difference is really between an interview and a questionnaire, right? So interview's done it like either in person or voice, like phone. A questionnaire is like you fill it out yourself without an interviewer. I just use the two interchangeably with survey. So one I would say like in-person survey, but basically these are all types of surveys, right? So phone, there'd be like a phone survey, an in-person survey, an online survey. They're all kinds of surveys. Questionnaire is just to mark out things that you do yourself versus someone's administering it to you, which is an interview, right? Does that make sense? No. Okay, so if I phone you on the phone and I have a bunch of survey questions to ask you, right? I am technically speaking in the official jargon of kind of social research, that's an interview, right? Probably with closed questions and maybe a few open ones, but that's an interview. If I send you a link online and you read the questions and you fill them out yourself, that's a questionnaire. I just use they're all types of surveys, right? Because you're surveying people. And I just kind of use them sloppily and interchangeably because they're all surveys to me, right? Does that make sense now? Okay, perfect. Other questions? Have I confused anyone else? Right. I think we're. Right. Yeah, advantages to questionnaires over interviews. Right. So you're not doing it yourself. So they're way cheaper, right? I will say, and just think of it this way, right? The average like 30 question interview, right? So done on a phone or in person, is going to take you probably somewhere around half an hour to do. Now, if you're paying someone even minimum wage, and you need 1,500 of these or 3,000 of them, and you're gonna, that person is going to spend a bunch of time on the phone, trying to get people. So like they might talk to someone for 30 seconds, that person hangs up. They're really expensive because you have to actually pay people to do it. And if you want it done in a reasonable amount of time, that means paying a lot of people to do it. So, questionnaires mailed out or online are much cheaper, simply because, well, it's expensive to mail things. It's still cheaper than paying people. And online, because it can be distributed so widely and so cheaply, while the online survey platforms are expensive, they're a lot cheaper than paying, a phone bank place to do it, or like, a telemarketing firm to do it for you. No interviewer effect, right? So, basically, you don't have that potential inter or intra-interviewer kind of bias that gets put in. And yeah, I mean, to some extent, social desirability bias gets reduced. Even, I know it sounds dumb, but even talking to a stranger, people will tend to answer more what they think you want them to answer than on a form, though there's still social desirability bias on like online and mailed out surveys. And I mean, this is my favorite one, is like in the US, it's something like 30% of people answer that they attend religious services weekly. And one person looking at these results, and I thought correctly, said, if that's the case, Sunday morning should be one of the busiest traffic times in America, right? Because 30% of the population is heading off to church on Sunday morning. And since that's not the case, we can sort of assume that probably people are not answering that truthfully, even on these questionnaires. So social desirability bias still exists, where people are like, yeah, I only go to church a couple times a year, but I really feel like I should say I go every week because I don't know why people would feel that way. But they might still answer in that kind of direction. It reduces it, but we still have issues and data that we can be pretty sure social desirability still plays a role, even though most of what we're doing now is questionnaire based, not interview based. Respondents are more likely to give genuine answers to sensitive questions. One of the more interesting ones, and this is a slightly different tool, and this is more qualitative. I'll tell you about it anyway because I always thought it was genius. Is there was one researcher out of the US, and she was doing research on the kind of sexual lives of college students in the US. And so she administered a bunch of surveys to them at all these different colleges. And then the last question was like, would you fill out for, the next month, a journal, like an online journal of, just telling me what's happening in your romantic lives? And she got this amazing data because once it was like in an online portal and she wasn't there asking them the questions, people admitted to all sorts of things that they never told her in person. Distressing things, but real, like how they really felt about things like hookup culture, how many times they really hooked up, what hooking up actually meant. It was really interesting. So online does put a distance where people will tell you things like, that they like really violent sexual encounters for whatever reason in online journals in ways that they won't in person because of that social desirability bias. All right. How am I doing for time? Oopsie. My daughter forgot her lunch. Oh dear. That can't be good. Disadvantages, right? You can't explain the question. If someone's like, I don't understand the question, you're kind of in trouble. Greater risk of missing data because of a lack of probing or supervision, right? So things that just don't get answered properly, you can get problems in there. Especially with mail surveys, people would just not fill out certain questions. Not as big a problem on online where it forces you to answer them, but sometimes with mail surveys, people just didn't answer like a section, and then you couldn't use that data. Difficult to ask a lot of questions because they need to be short. Depends how short your questions are, but yes, that's kind of true. Open questions, like I said, they're a bit of a shit show when it comes to questionnaires. Can cannot track whether the questions were answered in the original order. You can if you do it online. On paper, obviously not. Not appropriate for certain respondents. Yeah, again, language issues might make this difficult. And design, and you may not get a representative sample there. And designated respondents might not have completed the questionnaire, right? So yeah, you have high non-completion rates with questionnaires, and that's 100% true. Okay, online social surveys are growing in popularity. Not shockingly, they're very cheap in comparison to other forms of social research, and there's lots of firms that are offering, good tools to get them done. So yeah, they're a lot better. Even like distributing your survey, you can get these online panels to distribute them for you. It's not like I said, SurveyMonkey has a tool built in that you can be like, I need this. It's actually kind of cool. Like you can select the literally it's like a circle. So it's like you go into Google Maps and it's like a circle. It's like, I want it distributed in this geographic area. So like you could select just the city of Edmonton, or you could make it all of Alberta. So that's what I want. And then I need this many respondents, and I need it in this time frame, and it'll give you a number for how much it costs. It's actually a really cool tool, but it's super duper expensive. So you have to have research funding for doing that kind of stuff. So online surveys are growing in popularity, and the more social media advertising gets better, the more it's possible to recruit people. Again, expensive, but it works. This is from the textbook. Email surveys, again, we've moved away from email surveys to more like app-based and panel-based kind of surveys where people sign up for platforms and we pull people in. Just blind emailing surveys out to people stopped working a while ago. Okay. Web surveys, this is basically what I've been talking about. Respondents go to the website, and increasingly, right, you sign up for them and there's rewards. It's super fun. The rewards are kind of sucky and it takes forever to get them, to be honest. But nevertheless, if you're diligent, you can earn yourself a nice new PlayStation. It takes a while. It took me about 1.5 years to get enough gift cards, and I show up at the store with like this many $25 gift cards. I'm like, bleep. Anyway, web surveys can have an attractive appearance. Oh yeah, that's nice. Like sometimes they can look really pretty, and they can have kind of useful, features, filter questions, drop-down menus, things that make it really easy to make sure people answer properly, which is really nice. Forced answers where it doesn't allow you to skip through the page until you've answered everything, also really nice. It can be automatically downloaded to a database. This is why it's really great, right? So everybody does it, and then it just sits in the cloud, and you just download the .save file into SPSS or R, and you're working with the data instantly. There's no intermediate step of entering the physical data into anything, which is why I would never do anything a different way ever again. Okay, this is 100% true. Designing the questionnaire, clear presentation, make it easy on the eyes. It is designing the questionnaires online is such a pain because there's so many options now. Like some of these online survey panels, oh my God, they are so complex. They give you so many choices that it can be a real pain to do. And should you have one question per page, you have multiple questions per page, you have to make about 7,000 decisions. So it's tedious. Vertical or horizontal closed answers. How do you lay them out physically? You can include clear instructions, right? You can keep question and answer together on the same page. You can have kind of similar question types on the same page to keep things flowing really well for the person. So they're really nice, although a pain to design on the back end. I do not like them. Well, I do like them. I was talking about this, researcher-driven diaries. This is a little bit more qualitative, I think, for the most part. But having people fill out diaries, this is actually, where this is really common in terms of quantitative data, is this has been used by radio and television for a long time to track what you're watching, right? Especially in the era of streaming, where Netflix keeps all of their data squirreled away in a vault. Seriously, I've been into one of the TELUS facilities where Netflix keeps some of their servers for Edmonton. It is locked with 2 layers of biometric security because they're like, no one gets to touch the Netflix server if they don't work for Netflix. That's how closely they guard their data. In the era where we don't get to see data on who's watching what, diary-driven stuff, researcher-driven diary, where you have a bunch of questions. It's like, hey, what did you watch today? What did you listen to on the radio? What station did you listen to? Could be a really useful way to gather quantitative data through a kind of like diary. Now, I mean, the problem is whenever I've done these, at the end of the process, I get an email being like, hey, could you submit your diary? And I'm like, shit, I didn't do any of the days. And then I just make it up. But you know, that's par for the course. Yeah, people record their feelings or perceptions, or sometimes just what they did, right? Like how many times did they watch X, Y, Z? And these can be useful. Quantitatively, right, you're gathering just numbers. Qualitative, you know, you can ask people about all sorts of things. And sometimes because of that slight remove, if you can remind them to do it, they'll answer you really brutally honestly, and it's a really interesting tool. Okay, how many more slides do I have? Oh my God. I thought I was closer to the end than I am. All right. So, advantages of the diary method over NERS. I kind of already told you this, right? Fairly accurate data about, you know, frequency or time spent on behaviors. Good for getting sensitive data. Bad, more expensive. Attrition. People get tired of filling it out. And details may not be fully recorded, or people come to the end of the process and they're like, I didn't fill anything out, and then they go back and fill out a bunch of stuff retroactively. Yeah, please.
More expensive to find people.
Yeah, I mean, it's also because a lot of it is open data, right? So then once you gather it, so whatever you had to pay to get the data gathered, you then have to pay someone to code it for you, right? And that is a time-consuming process, right?
Code it yourself.
Oh, you could, but why? I mean, either that or it would be, but depending on how many respondents you get, it could take a really long time, right? And that's the problem. A small study, you could definitely do it. If you're talking like, I mean, or if you have grad students, you pay them next to nothing. They work incredibly hard because they're eager and foolishly believe that academia has payoffs. Those fools. I was one of them. So, I mean, you could get your grad students to do it. But yeah, generally, either it's going to cost you, you know, money to get someone to do it, or enormous amounts of time. Like, think about even a diary, if you send it out to 500 people, going through 500 diaries and coding all that data, that in itself is, for one person, is months of work, right? So does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, so I think that's it. Why don't we, you know, I'm almost done. I wanted to finish. We have 5 minutes left, but I've beaten you to death with survey stuff. Let's finish it on, is today Tuesday?
Yes.
God, I'm like, is it Thursday? Are we seeing each other next week? Or okay, we'll finish. We have a few slides left on Thursday, but it mostly talks about using other people's data, secondary data analysis. So not something you need for the mini lab. So we'll finish up on that on Thursday, and then we'll jump into an even more exciting topic, which is what is it? What is the next topic? Oh, quantitative sampling. Woohoo! I love it, dude. I actually do find it interesting, but I'm sure the glazed over look will come soon. Hello. Hang on, take my mic off.
Will we be able to finish the mini lab at the lab, like work on survey questions
With Celine? Yeah, you'll have a little bit. You'll be like today. Basically, you'll be looking at some bad ones, like some. Well, I have 2 surveys for you to look at to kind of critique, like maybe what's wrong with each of them, what works, what doesn't work on each of these surveys, and then I think there's a little bit of space to work on it in group, and there might be a little bit of time to run things by her at the end too.
About booking a meeting
Okay.
because I asked for an extension in the second lab because I sent this in my email, but I couldn't wrap my head around it.
Right, and did I answer your
I
email?
don't think so.
Okay.
I don't know if you
I thought I had caught up, but maybe I missed it.
I said it on Thursday, I think.
I-
Or no, I said it yesterday.
Yesterday?
I think so.
Okay. It's possible. Let me check in my email. I thought I had emailed everybody back, but I could have missed. I may have missed it. Do you have a few minutes now, or
Yeah.
okay? Why don't I'll answer her question and then I'll see if I can find.
Very quick question.
Yeah.
So when you're citing, say you're taking it from like I don't know, some psychology website.
Sure.
Do you put it at the very bottom of your survey? Like what? How do you format that?
Oh, that's a good question. That's probably how I would do it, or like
Yeah.
like put a footnote mark, at the
Oh, a
top of the
footnote.
section, right? So like it's like personal characteristics. You could have like and then a footnote and have it at the bottom of the page be like, this questionnaire or these answers are taken from the ASRS or whatever it was
Oh, okay.
survey developed
Okay.
by. And I don't remember how you cite a survey. You'd probably like Purdue
Just-
Owl would
Should
be.
I just look it up then?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you send me an email too, I can probably find it. I just don't remember offhand because I haven't cited a survey tool in a while. And the less you do it,
But
the
you
less.
do expect citations like for the mini lab.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you do it, yeah. So like for the mini lab, yeah, just at the bottom put
Just
a
at the
footnote.
bottom.
Be like, this is the tool. This is where I got it.
Okay.
If you know who the author is, throw their name in there as well.
Okay.
um,
And is it like MLA or like APA or does it matter?
We'll do APA.
APA?
Yeah.
Okay.
MLA. Modern languages. Who needs them? I always use Chicago, but
Oh, okay.
I don't know how Chicago works for that. But
Alright, perfect.
yeah, APA would be good.
Thank you.
You have a very quick question?
Yeah, it's just like, so this is the thing I'm planning to use.
Okay.
It just says that you need permission from the dude who created it. I'm like, I don't know if we should worry about that for using
You know what? You're using it for class, so
Yeah.
don't bother. Like, you don't need to email Richard M. Lee. Don't.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it. And frankly, that's completely unenforceable anyway. So you could use it and just be like, "Hey, I cited him. That's all I need for permission." Robert M. Lee can go suck a lemon, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, thanks.
You don't own your tools once you publish them. Anyone can use it. That's how knowledge works.
Yay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Just have to answer my daughter here. All right. Sorry, I have too much stuff here. Like, I honestly swear I thought I had answered everybody. But let me just take a quick looky see. Was it a fairly lengthy email? Okay, because I answered one where the person has like really complex questions, and I was like,
I just asked for a meeting.
oh, okay,
If I start writing an email, it's way too long.
that's fair. What's your name? Oh yeah, okay, so that came in yesterday at 4. Okay, so I'd already like checked out for the day, and I haven't gone back to my email. Okay, that makes sense. I saw it, and I just email time is later. Okay, so what would work best for you here? Like today, tomorrow?
Anytime. Tomorrow I have like a 2-hour break after 11:50. Because I have
So you're done at 11:50?
yeah, and then I have like a 2-hour break until the lab.
So that's noon till. Okay. Can we do 2 o'clock?
Yes.
Okay. In my office at 2 o'clock. Does that work?
Is your office like
Tori.
on just the first floor?
Yeah.
Okay, because the D was confusing.
It's because we're in like in 1-62. It's a big open room, and on the back wall there's offices D, E, F, G. So I'm in the first one, which is D. So you'll see there's a big label on the door that says Center for Criminological Research. Hang on a sec. Let me create, because I must, on Wednesday, create event, and we said 2 o'clock, right?
In fairness, an argument could be made that if you're striking it on the side with the break, it would
That's
have
you.
a minuscule different tone.
Perfect. This is how I remember it, or I will forget, and then I will be gone, and you will be emailing me, where the hell are you? But if I put it in, I will not forget. So I'm good.
Another question. For the third lab, for the third minute,
Yeah.
for the